Good afternoon. I'm Megan Tompkins-Stange, an assistant professor of public policy at the University of Michigan. And on behalf of Dean Michael Barr, who is watching in the audience here today, as well as the faculty and students at the Ford School, it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this Policy Talks at the Ford School event with author David Frum. I'll be talking today with David about his new book, Trumpocalypse, Restoring American Democracy. It's a very, very catchy title. The central questions of the book are ones that really continue to occupy our political discourse at the moment. How is it that President Trump came to dominate the Republican Party? Why do so many Americans support him no matter the outcome? Trumpocalypse really examines these questions closely, and it also proposes policy measures about countering the influence that Trump's presidency has had on both American culture and political institutions. Before we dive into our discussion, I want to just briefly introduce David for those of you who may not be familiar with his career. David is a staff writer at The Atlantic, and he's the author of 9 books, including The Right Man, The Surprise Presidency of George W. Bush, and Trumpocracy, The Corruption of the American Republic. In 2001 and 2002, he was a speechwriter for President George W. Bush. He was also president of the Harvard Law School chapter of the Federalist Society, a director of the Republican Jewish Coalition, and the chairman of the board of trustees of Britain's center-right think tank, Policy Exchange. I'm just getting all the mistakes done early on. And he's also the proud grandson of a U of M graduate, Florence Rothberg. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
You are indeed.
Who studied English literature in the class of 1932. That is pretty amazing to have a woman graduating at that time. So we recognize David as an honorary Wolverine, and we really welcome him virtually to Ann Arbor. Wish you were here in person.
Me too.
Before we dive in to our substantive conversation, just a couple of quick notes about the format. We'll have some time at the end of the event today for audience questions. We've received some in advance, and you can also still submit questions in the live chat box on YouTube, or you can tweet your questions to #PolicyTalks. And without further ado, welcome, David, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. What a pleasure I'm about to say to be here. I guess I'm not anywhere, but to be with you.
This interstitial space we'll create together. So I'd like to just start by commenting that Trumpocalypse is just compulsively readable, which I guess is not a surprise given your career as a journalist. I tore through it in one sitting and just really enjoyed it, in addition to learning so much.
Well,
I also, as an academic, really appreciated how well researched it was, and really the argument is grounded in a lot of empirical evidence as opposed to a polemic, for example. So I just wanted to say that, and thank you so much for coming and talking about it with us.
Well, thank you. Trumpocalypse ended up being part of a 2-book series. That was not the plan. There's a previous volume called Trumpocracy. And those titles, you were kind to say they were catchy. I think they're kind of the opposite. I think we could actually use them as highway sobriety tests. Can you pronounce them both? But they were chosen for reasons, because the first book was a study of Donald Trump's power. And as I don't have to tell a University of Michigan audience, that's what the word "assy," the suffix "assy," they're from the same suffix you see in democracy and other forms of governance. And an apocalypse, although we tend to use it now to mean the end of the world, that's not actually what that word means. An apocalypse is a revelation. And it happened that the Christian book of Revelations foretold the end of the world. But anything can be revealed. And so what I try to do in the second of these 2 books is to give a vision of the future, where we're going, and how we might make sure that it's a good destination, not a bad one.
Great. So given the title, the book certainly does unpack some of the pathologies of Trump's presidency, his personal characteristics, and his decision-making. also how the Republican Party and a very regressive politics enabled that rise. But it also more broadly really looks at destructive social forces. You call it white ethnic chauvinism is one, economic plutocracy. So sort of dark partisan forces that have over time corroded our democratic institutions. And your argument is essentially that Trump is, to have a bad analogy, a mere branch on a rotted root of a giant American democracy tree, right? The real work is to come post-election. I hope that you could briefly kind of reflect on this narrative and how you came to view it that way.
Yeah, well, I actually, in the book, I don't deal a lot with the pathological personality of Donald Trump. I mean, there's a lot of reporting on that. I'm reading Michael Cohen's book right now, Michael Cohen being Donald Trump's longtime henchman and attorney. There's a lot of that, and I had no special advantage. But it's a big country, 320 odd million people. There are going to be predictably a certain number of pathological personalities. Mm-hmm. The United States, like most democracies, but here more than most, has an extraordinarily complex sifting mechanism for political leadership to keep out pathological personalities. Historically, we've tended to be worried indeed that the American political system brings us mediocre personalities, people who don't stand out in any particular way. That's been kind of a worry of a lot of the writing about American government for a long time. Mm-hmm. So how did this character get through a system that was expressly designed to stop him? That's the thing I am endlessly fascinated by, that he should have been screened out. Everyone assumed he'd be screened out by the party mechanism, by the primary system, remember when we used to talk about the invisible primary, the elite primary, and then by the complex voting system. The justification for the Electoral College, to the extent it still has any, is that it's supposed to do a little bit of weighing and not just to count votes where some demagogue could power through, but to provide yet one more check on the system. And it instead actually turned out that it was the raw counting of numbers that produced the more responsible result, and the Electoral College, supposedly the screening mechanism, that brought us the more demagogic result. So
there's a key word that you use throughout the book when talking about Trump, but also the broader political environment around him, and that word is dominance, right? So Trump's objective throughout his presidency is to assert dominance, whether that's political, economic, or cultural. And also that the GOP's support of Trump is, to some extent, and his constituents as well, his voters, is representing a fear of the loss of power. Or I think in the book you put it, a defense against losing a distinctive way of life. Could you comment on that? Is that why this guy got through, as you said, skidded through?
I think that the desire for power, is not an altogether bad thing. I mean, that's what people compete for at elections. I mean, that in fact you could argue that the way we should understand democracy, I mean, it's not possible for all the citizens of a country, especially one as huge as the United States, to participate in every decision. So I have always been impressed by the definition of democracy offered by Joseph Schumpeter now almost 3/4 of a century ago, that democracy is a system of government where elites compete for power by peaceful means at the ballot box. So it's not wrong to look for power. The dominance is something more than power, because power is always imperfect. Power is always conditional. It's always compromised. Power is always something aimed at a goal. Power to do what? I mean, we use the same analogy to describe the electricity that motors our way of life. It is power that allows you to do something. And power in a politician, as Robert Caro talks about in his famous series of books about Lyndon Johnson. Johnson wanted to do things and he needed to get power to do them. Dominance is an end in itself. You're not dominant for a reason. You're dominant to be dominant. That it's its own satisfaction. And I think there's something else that has been going on. America has always been a kind of imperfect democracy. It didn't start as democracy at all. It didn't intend to be one. It grew into one gradually, but by fits and starts. And people who grew up in my era, who absorbed a story of democracy as an evolution, that that the political power was extended to non-property owning white men. And then in the Civil War, slavery was ended, and at least the promise of participation was offered to the freed slaves. That promise was over time made more and more real through the civil rights movement. Women were brought in, then under 18s and the District of Columbia, and you can track the progress through a sequence of constitutional amendments. The truth is that the United States has gone backwards away from those ideas as often as it's gone forward. But at least since the middle 1960s, and with accelerating speed, or so it seemed, in the 1970s, the United States was moving toward a more participatory, inclusive, and accountable system of government. The Civil Rights era, followed by the Watergate reforms, that's the direction we thought we were walking. And the deviations, well, they were, nothing's perfect, but they were seen as exceptions. What's begun to happen, I think, really in the past decade, is that we seem to be heading in a very different direction, and not as a result of blunders and mistakes, but by increasingly conscious action. And that's one of the things that is so sinister about both Trumpocracy and the Trumpocalypse we're heading to, is that one of the stories we can tell is this is a story about Donald Trump's party realizing it has an agenda that cannot be achieved by means of peaceful competition at the ballot box, not if everyone is allowed to participate. And rather than modify the agenda to something that people might like more, that could be competitive, since especially 2010, Republicans have said, we need to change the rules. We don't want to give up our agenda. So let's change the rules of the game so the agenda can prevail by eliminating a certain percentage of the population from voting. And that is really at the center of the debate now. I mean, Donald Trump obviously has no strategy to win votes. He has a strategy to stop votes.
So voter repression, especially in areas with a high number of people of color, gerrymandering, you talk about in the book, as another sort of malignant force in realizing equal voting rights for all. Again, sort of tying that back to defending a certain way of life against an encroaching diverse population. Maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the policy solutions that you mentioned in the book. There are many, but I think talk about gerrymandering for one, and how you might do that differently, and how would you direct the Republican Party to reframe, if indeed they are looking for equality and justice as they have, in your opinion, in the past?
Well, maybe start with a macro way of thinking about this, which is, I think, I situate a lot of what is happening in the United States in a global context. I think, and maybe it's because I grew up in Canada and I spent a lot of time there, and I spent, as you mentioned in the introduction, a lot of time in the United Kingdom. I always think about the United States compared to other peer countries. I'm generally, if the claim, the idea of American exceptionalism, that America is radically different from other advanced democracies, to the extent that that was ever true, I think it's less and less true. I think America functions more and more like Great Britain or Germany or Canada than it did 100 years ago. So as I look at all of these countries, what I see is that the story of recent times has been a story of globalization is not the right word for this, but of lowering barriers between nation states, trade, investment, migration, and then increasing diversity within nation states. And that's had many, many positive consequences. And by and large, I am an endorser of open trade and with some caveats, open investment flows, and with more caveats, the possibility that people can move across borders. But what we have created is a world in which the nation matters less than it did, say, half a century ago. And what some people had hoped is, as the nation mattered less, humanity would matter more, that we would think of ourselves as global citizens. Well, the opposite happened. As the nation mattered less, instead of advancing to bigger and wider loyalties, we have retreated to narrower and more specific loyalties. And so everywhere we see that ethnicity and socio-cultural groups, and many of these distinctions quite unreal and invented, like, that you can create a culture war over whether or not you wear a mask during an airborne pandemic. But everywhere in the United States, most of all, that we have created these very sharp divides between groups of citizens. So my master solution to everything is we have to reinvigorate the idea of the nation, not because the nation isn't perfect thing. Nationalism has had many destructive consequences over the past century: wars and protectionism and so many negative consequences. But without nations, there aren't electorates, and without electorates, there aren't democracy. And so there aren't democracies. And so I am concerned with all the ideas I offer. The master idea behind all of them is to reknit the bonds of nationhood. And that means connecting citizens more one to another, but also in some ways restoring somewhat the boundaries around nation, and especially by restricting immigration, so that you create a sense of national identity, national kinship that can then be more powerful than subnational identities of race and culture.
So one of the things you talk about with regard to a sense of nationhood, you argue that Democrats are typically allergic to the idea of the nationhood. It's associated with, the Nazis and things like that in recent memory. But you also argue that in order for Americans to, for example, feel embracing of our healthcare system, we need to have a more developed sense of our nationhood. And you talk about the example of England and the NHS, which is really a point of pride and identity for people living in Great Britain. Could you comment on that?
Yeah. Well, this is something I've sort of come around to in later life. I mean, as I say, growing up in Canada, one of the things that always irritated me was when you talk to Canadians about what made you Canadian, that the Canadian healthcare system would, in every poll and in any informal conversation, rank as the top one or two. When I was a younger person, so there's so many more profound things about what it means to be a nation than this. And it seems kind of, tawdry that this would become a mark. But over the years, I've come to see this wisdom in that. People are much more bound by tangible things than by abstract things. That be able to say, look, this piece of plastic that I don't deserve, I share it with other people who are pretty randomly chosen. And it is not shared with billions of other people. And it's not because, and the people I share it to are not nicer than the people I don't share it with. And the people who don't share, they're not worse. It's just, there is this bond. There is this boundary that has been drawn, and everyone inside this line gets this piece of plastic. And that means they have a call on one another in case of medical emergency. And that turns out to be very meaningful to people in a way that appeals to history and cultural development. Those seem more abstract. And when the chips are really down, you say, what does it mean to be part of us? You say, well, being part of us means I get this thing. And being not us means you don't get this thing. And that's not a moral barrier, but it's a practical one. And so through Trumpocalypse, I am looking for ways that we can bind Americans more together in tangible ways, so that whether they wear a mask or whether they don't, whether they wear a red hat or whether they don't, that they can feel I have more in common with these people. I mean, as it is, that I think, and we've seen this through the terrible COVID experience, that when you watch the discussion among the kind of people who would attend the University of Michigan or watch this, I think many have this feeling, I have a lot more in common, they think, with someone like me who lives in New Zealand than I have in common with someone not like me who lives 80 miles away. And I understand where that comes from, but that really is a social problem. And Donald Trump has exploited that social problem in the context of an electoral system that gives the people who live 80 miles away much more power than they might have in any other kind of political system.
Sure. So going back to the example of immigration that you brought up, in a world where we're trying to draw on these more principles of nationhood, right? Or common binding, the collective, the commons, if you will. How do we build that sense of connectedness when the country is divided 50-50 on just about everything? And I'm interested in the immigration example because restricting immigration is much more of a traditional conservative opinion. But in the book, you have a lot of concern about the policies as Trump has enacted them against child separation and these sorts of things. So you really see it from both ways. How would you bring that to the larger polity, and how would you go about reframing it in a way that would be more conducive to those bonds forming?
Yeah. Well, immigration is, of all policy subjects, one of the most challenging because the trade-offs are so acute. I accept the argument that immigration is generally good for the economy as a whole. It is not good for everyone in the economy. It confers large benefits on some. It imposes large costs on others. But when you net, and the people on whom it imposes the costs tend to be in the bottom half of the labor market, and the people who get the benefits tend to be in the top half. So it's not very equitable. But when you net them out, the costs of the people at the bottom and the benefits of the people at the top, you get a surplus, and so it's beneficial to the economy as a whole. The problem is that the economies that benefit most from immigration often occur inside societies that have the most trouble dealing with immigration. And what I think this is kind of a complicated idea, but it's important, or at least I think it's important, that what characterizes the developed societies of the Western world are very low birth rates. So that means that even relatively modest flows of immigration have the effect of very rapidly creating large populations of people who weren't born there, and even more enormous populations of people whose parents weren't born there. The United States got more immigration relative to its population in the year 1900 than it does now. But that flow's impact on the sense of belonging in the United States was less, because even though the United States was taking in enormous numbers of immigrants relative to population bigger than now, the number of foreign-born in the population was dropping because Americans are raising so many children of their own. Whereas now, because Americans have so few children of their own, the proportion of foreign-born in the population is skyrocketing. And so that creates a sense of, it becomes very difficult to build a common sense of Americanness in that context. And I think we see that. I mean, it's something we all remark. Many people think it's a good thing, but it creates weaker bonds between citizens, and in the mistrust, in the unwillingness to share, you create opportunities for all kinds of mischief. I talk in the book about the decline in investment in public schooling, and how you can see that states with lower levels of immigration have higher levels of commitment, even if they're quite conservative states like Indiana, than quite liberal states with high levels of immigration like California, because it's hard to persuade people to pay taxes to educate children with whom they don't feel that fundamental kinship.
So a critic would say to that argument, as I play devil's advocate here, there's been some research on the fact that naturalized citizens, so people who immigrated to the US on a work visa and decide to go ahead and get their citizenship, are amongst the most patriotic and the most committed to this American ideal, right, as a land of hope and promise. What would you say to that? And I guess a related question would be, is this a difference between legal immigration and undocumented immigration? Maybe you could.
I'm a naturalized citizen myself, and
so you know.
Well, so I know something of the complexity of it. But I don't think about this as a moral judgment. This is not a criticism of anybody. It is an observation about how societies behave, and not just this society, but others. I mean, you can just see, how the bonds of social solidarity were strongest in the United States in exactly the period when the percentage of foreign-born of the population was lowest. And as that percentage has increased, and that's not a comment on the immigrants themselves. It's not. I'm looking here. My focus is less on the behavior of immigrants and on the reaction of native-born populations to the arrival of immigrants. And I look at this in a non-moral way. I mean, it might be, you could argue that the native-born are wrong. They should behave differently, but across borders from country to country, they tend not to, especially in periods of slow economic growth and a lot of concentration of wealth at the top of society. So, sorry, I just got a internet glitch. I hope I didn't disrupt anything.
No, you're good. It jumped a little bit. You came back.
All right. So anyway, but I lay the evidence as I see it out for people to look at, and they can review it and make their own assessments.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And then you do have a number of, again, sort of concrete policy recommendations, ranging from eliminating the filibuster, DC statehood, publication of tax returns. Which of these, this portfolio of policies, how will those help to realize this goal?
Well, I think one of the things that is going on behind all of these policies is the United States has the advantage of having one of the oldest continuously functioning constitutions in the world. And it also has the disadvantage of having one of the oldest continuously functioning constitutions in the world, because that means the United States is governed by a lot of things that can only be explained by the fact that these ideas were written down 200 or 100 years ago, and no one's had the opportunity to fix them, even though everyone who looked at them later decided to do a different way.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things is that, it's just not true in it. The kind of power that Bill Barr, the Attorney General of the United States, has over federal prosecutions, that just doesn't exist in other developed countries, because they don't locate the power to prosecute or not to prosecute in political officials directly answerable to the head of government, because they've all seen it. They say that's not good. And so as they've designed modern constitutions, they've located the power elsewhere. So it just, that kind of, and in area after, the idea that politicians draw their own boundaries. Gerrymandering exists in every system where there are geographic constituencies, but it never is as extreme in the United States, because in every other system, there is some kind of large non-political element to the drawing of boundaries. The idea that state governments, elected often in pretty startlingly undemocratic ways, draw not only state boundaries, but federal boundaries. That no one does that. And there's a reason no one has borrowed this element of the United States Constitution in all the years since.
It hasn't gone viral.
It hasn't gone viral. With many of these reforms, I'm looking, and the problem is that I think there's a period from you can date it when you want, but there's maybe the progressive era through the 20th century. I think that the feeling was that American institutions, archaic as they often were on the whole doing better and better and better. And the United States delivered a lot of successes through the 20th century. It won a couple of world wars. It won the Cold War. It developed delivered a high standard of living to tens of millions of people. It overcame much of its history of slavery. It integrated the Great Immigration. You can say this system, for all of its antiquity, seems to be doing the job pretty well. But I think since the beginning of the 21st century, it doesn't look that way. So I'm interested in doing things to bring the system forward, and looking especially at how do you take the increasingly radical problem of the massive overrepresentation of rural America, and how do you fix that? And this is maybe too long an answer to this.
No, it's great.
At a school of government, it might be interesting. So in the 2010s, the Republicans had a level of dominance of state and local government they hadn't seen since the 1920s. In fact, that neither party has had since the Republicans had it in the 1920s. But when you look at Republican dominance in the 1920s, it was based in the most dynamic parts of the country. You look at Calvin Coolidge's election victory, that he was winning massive. He won a majority in New York State. He won a bigger majority in Pennsylvania, and in the center of the new economy, the state of Michigan, where the automobile and tire and radio belt, Calvin Coolidge won almost 75% of the vote in 1924. Well, today you've got one-party dominance or at least until 2018 and maybe until this year, you've had for a decade one-party dominance, but it's based on the least dynamic parts of the country. And those parts, we're basically running the Bryan versus McKinley election in reverse forever. And with Bryan always winning the Electoral College, even though Bryan keeps losing the popular vote, and you get a country which is being governed by places where songs aren't written and products aren't developed. It's perverse and unsustainable and needs to be fixed.
And William Jennings Bryan and the Silver Standard, maybe not the best policy idea.
Well, I think actually, to my mind, I actually think Bryan was right about silver. But I guess the gold standard. He actually was right about that sort of by accident. But the point was the reason the gold standard was a pretty bad idea, but the reason McKinley was able to impose it was because it was connected to other kinds of industrial modernity. That McKinley was obviously valued factories and cities, and produced campaign literature in more different languages than anybody had ever seen before. Whereas Bryan was very much a candidate of an ethnic chauvinist.
Mhm.
He was a prohibitionist, which meant that alcohol prohibition was one of those issues in the 19th century of saying to immigrants and newcomers, you're not welcome.
Mhm.
And we're going to regulate your amusements in way to conform to the prejudices of the pre-existing inhabitants of the country. So he was a cultural chauvinist,
Mhm.
even if
Mhm.
he actually had a point about silver.
Well, at least he's got that going for him. So I'd like to pivot and talk more about you and your identity as a conservative. It's been central in your life, obviously, throughout your entire career. And I'm reminded of a quote my wonderful senior faculty colleague, Marina Whitman, told me, which is, "I didn't leave the Republican Party left me."
Yeah.
And so as someone who has long identified as a center-right conservative, and you do write in the book, Trump remade the party in his own image.
Yeah.
Is there a place for you in the new GOP? And if there is, what needs to change in order for you to come back into the fold?
Well, I am a registered Republican. I remain one. And I do strongly identify with the party. And I live in the District of Columbia, not a state, but if I lived in most of the states, I think I would be more at home in certainly the state Republican Party than in the state Democratic Party. And I think I wouldn't use that line about the party leaving me, because look, we all change. And the people sometimes think it's like a positive thing to say, I believe exactly all the same things I believed 30 years ago. Everyone else changed, I stayed the same. And you think, well, I'm sure that's actually not true, but if it is true, it's not something to brag about. The world's changed, but I have not absorbed a new idea since Gerald Ford was president. So my own ideas on many things have changed over the years, and so that's created some pressures and some divisions.
But certainly the party that is enabling Trump, from the book, I would argue you don't agree with that, right? So,
no, I think that's a point, and I think. Look, I am hopeful that there is going to be enough of a reckoning in November that Republicans will figure out this was actually not a very good. Not only was it wrong, but it was also unwise, imprudent. But where does it need to go? I mean, the United States, barring some really radical change in its institutions, is fated to be a two-party system. The Electoral College, the geographic districts. I mean, it would take some pretty big changes to make it not a two-party system. And maybe that would be a good thing, but we're stuck there for the time being. And the Republican Party has become an increasingly radical party as it's tried to combine an agenda that is a minority agenda with a base that is a minority base, but they're different. What the agenda, which is quite a plutocratic one, and the base, which is quite a down market one. I think as of now, something like 75 or more of the richest congressional districts in the country are Democratic, and only about a quarter, 25 or so of the richest congressional districts in the country, or the 100 richest, are Republican. So you've got a party that is resting on the votes of people in hard-pressed areas, enacting an agenda that can't favor those people, and so the result is it becomes anti-democratic, it becomes authoritarian, it becomes demagogic.
Absolutely.
I think we need a party of the center right, and my formula for what that party needs to look like is it needs to be culturally modern. It needs to be economically inclusive. It has to offer something for the great middle class, not just for a few people at the top. And it also has to be environmentally responsible, because I think one of the things that COVID taught us, or should have taught us, is that problems created by the material universe can lay low the most advanced civilization. And as problems go, COVID was not one of the worst. The climate problems that are coming are going to dwarf anything we've experienced in the past year.
Absolutely. So, and you have a wonderful chapter in the book on climate change and some of your recommendations there, including carbon tax. So I think that's a really powerful chapter that I enjoyed in the book, some of your recommendations there. So this is like sort of the $1 million question that we all talk about around the virtual water cooler. Seeing presumably your friends and colleagues who are in the Senate, in the House, and who are aligned with Trump, for better or for worse, what does that feel like? And can you explain to us why so many Republicans are sort of enabling Trump's agenda, even if they really morally disagree with him or consider his behavior really abhorrent? What is the incentive there for that dissonance to exist?
Well,
As an insider.
from among the elected officials, I think a couple of things are going on. The first is they were completely taken by surprise by Trump's two successes: first winning the nomination, then winning the electoral college success that he did. They were preparing for a different future, and they were wrong-footed, and so they had to scramble to get on the right side of a president, because members of the president's party always want to be on the right side of the president. And then something. Two other things happened along with that. One is I think our campaign finance system, where politicians must raise enormous amounts of money and raise it over and over again, tends to select for people who have a lot of willingness to submit to humiliation. If you're a person who's a kind of proud, prickly personality, you're not going to do well in politics under any circumstances, but you're certainly not going to do well in a political system where you can't even play the game unless you can raise millions and millions of dollars. And I was just reading today that it looks like in the Purdue-Ossoff race, in Georgia Senate race, I mean, something like $100 million is going to be spent just in that one Senate race. The degree of to raise those funds, you have to put up with a lot. And so you are selecting for people who are ready to be kicked. And then Donald Trump, I think, has a very personal, one of his gifts is he has an ability to spot moral weakness in people and to bring pressure to bear on them in a way that just crushes them. And that's kind of a mystery, how exactly he does that, how he has that intuition, but he really does. I don't want to raise hypothetical questions, but it is interesting to think, would it have been different if there had been such a figure who appeared on the Democratic side? Would the Democratic Party have been more resistant? And in some ways, I think yes, just because it's a much more messy coalition. So it's harder to put together to get a majority of the minority working inside the Democratic Party the way you can inside the Republican Party. But when you look at what happened with Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, I mean, it is possible for very extreme people to come to power inside parties of what was until recently a party of the center left and lead it into very extreme directions.
Absolutely. So one thing that really struck me about the book throughout it is that you submitted the manuscript in March. The introduction you're writing in March. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So basically, like early days of coronavirus, it's certainly before mass collective action and movement for Black Lives last summer, and it's so prescient in so many instances about the political landscape. There's one line that kind of is eerie, like Trumpism won't be so easily removed. And I think when you wrote that, it was from the society, but now we're facing that as an actual consequence, perhaps, of the election. So for probably our last question here before I go to the audience, could you comment on what you would add to the manuscript, change in the manuscript for the second edition, given the hindsight of the last 7 or 8 months?
Well, I have been, thank you for the compliment. I have been very worried about how difficult it will be to remove Donald Trump from power in an electoral system that, I think one of the things that, again, this is maybe my Canadianism, but I watch on inauguration day, and there's all this self-complimenting about the peaceful transition of power and this unique American spectacle. And I wonder how people in Denmark feel about that. They have transitions of power all the time, and they don't pat themselves on the back. They just do it. And in Great Britain, the labor goes out, and no one. And partly this is driven by the fact that there's a noon. It always happens at noon, and then cable has hours to fill with vacuous commentary, and so they say vacuous things. But it also has to do with the truth, which is really the opposite of the thing that is being said, which is in no other democratic system on earth is the potential for serious social disruption as real as it is in the United States. That in Denmark, it's just not a thing that is even thinkable. That if the Social Democrats lose, they don't turn it over to the Christian Democrats and vice versa. In the United States, it is kind of thinkable. And this is a society with a lot of weapons distributed everywhere. I think the main thing I would address in a second edition is one of the things I was very concerned about from the beginning of the Trump era is that political opposition to Trump work through the political process. And for the first 3.5 years, that wish came true. And the reason I wish so fervently, I made it such a point, because it's non-obvious, because the American political process is so non-responsive, so distorted, because it's not true that if you get 50% of the vote plus one, you get to pick the government. And that's true just about everywhere else. It's not true here. You can do it with a lot less than 50%, and sometimes if you have more than 50%, you don't get to do it. But the risk is that politics would move from the political system to the streets, and that is what happened in the summer of 2020. I think that from a crass political point of view, I think that movement to the streets hurt Joe Biden and hurt the Democratic Party. That became Donald Trump's strongest argument. I think it's pushed that the nature of the way that the politics took to the streets pushed some groups away from the Biden coalition. I think that's probably the reason that Biden is having trouble with
the middle right or the middle left, center left.
It's not ideological; it's cultural. That a movement whose slogan is "Black Lives Matter" raises questions in the minds of people who do not identify as Black, and some get very excited and enthusiastic, but others step away. But what I really worry about most is if anything goes wrong with the electoral process in October and November of 2020, that what happened in the summer of 2020, that could be really a vision of the future. You could persuade very large numbers of Americans that the political system doesn't work, doesn't respond, in which case they're fools to take part in it and they need to do other things. And boy, am I afraid of that outcome. And I would want to talk about that more if they're when the paperback comes out, assuming we're not dealing with a Trump second term, and that has all kinds of other sinister possibilities.
Absolutely. I guess just to conclude, it's very clear throughout the book that you have very strong personal core beliefs about, America as a role or a force for equality and morality and the liberal humane principles that are really the bedrock of our democracy, and I think the summer of protests kind of brought to the fore the fact that for many people in the US who are more marginalized and more vulnerable populations, those principles, they believe, are applying mostly to the white population. So I think that's a really interesting point and complication to this argument that I would love to read another book on. So, well,
I think as I think a lot of these answers aren't easy, and I can well understand why people get frustrated with the political process and think they can do something in a more direct way. And the answer is not that the political process works or the political process is fair. The answer is that everything else fails, and it's the only hope. And you have to, and legality is always the only answer. This is one of the great insights of the Central European revolutionaries of 1989, and who insisted, even under communism, which was as rigged a system as there could be, on working within the rules. They would use the communist constitutions against the communist governments. The communists had never intended their constitutions to be taken seriously, but people like Václav Havel insisted on it. And in Russia, people like Sakharov, Soviet Union, people like Sakharov insisted on it, because the insight that Havel especially propounded was the nature of the revolution determines the nature of the following regime. If the revolution is unlawful, is violent, the successor state will be unlawful and violent. If the revolution proceeds by legality, the successor state will proceed by legality.
It's very well said. So we're going to go to some questions from the audience. The first question I have is, in a country with strong racial and class segregation, can you predict challenges in building a national identity with so much structural inequality?
We've done it before. Again, not completed, but it can be done. And we largely did it in the years starting about 1915 and through the Great Depression, and then accelerating after in the post-war world, in the civil rights of America. It took the form of the creation of the high school system, the interstate highways. One of the things that cultural critics of the United States in the 1960s and 70s complained about was the sameness of American life. And this was at a time when there was obviously a lot of racial inequality and racial segregation. But but people who watched America in 1965 were struck by, there were Howard Johnsons everywhere. Americans lived lives that were increasingly similar. And this isn't an entirely good thing, but it can be done. And you're not going to build an egalitarian society in a country the size of a continent with 1/3 of a billion people living here. But what you can do is build a society that is moving somewhat in that direction and that has a sense of identity. And I think it is the direction of the trend much more than the absolute level of the outcome that is important. If you lived in America in 1970, you thought you were in a society that was moving toward cohesion. And if you live in America now, I think we all feel we're living in a society that's moving away from cohesion.
Great, thank you. Second question is, how do we reimagine civic education to increase the electorate's knowledge base and engagement?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think you can't do it. We ask the schools to do so much. We ask them to do too much. I don't think you can do it in the school system because people are the wrong age to care about these particular issues. It's something that is going to happen later. Historically, the most important school of civic education in the United States was the jury. That people were called to participate in juries, and through that experience, Tocqueville remarks this, that it's the jury system that was the real school. And there are a lot of reasons we rely on juries less than we used to, but I think we need to be thinking about, are there ways that we can give people a feeling of meaningful participation through whether empowering neighborhood advisory councils in cities, but something where you actually can learn by doing. I don't think civic education is something you learn from a book, because the book can't persuade you that this is important in a way that obviously it's important to, master math and science. A 17-year-old can understand that, but a 17-year-old, not right now, they're pretty agitated, but in a time of more calm, as we've seen, it's hard to explain to a 17-year-old why you should care how the town decides whether the bars stop serving at 11 or whether the bars can keep serving till midnight.
So, and that also brings to mind, it's very Tocquevillian to think about sort of local civic associations as schoolhouses of citizenship, I believe is his term, right? So it's an interesting, instead of a state-governed mechanism, the schools, it's an advocation for a more private, perhaps nonprofit organization-based means.
You have to learn. This is something you need to learn. I mean, I remember getting this, talking a lot to young people when in the first shock after Donald Trump was elected. And I was doing some talks that became the book Trumpocalypse, and people asked, "What can I do? What can I do?" That was and I said, "What you should do is you should get involved in something that's public and something that seems boring. Join a committee." Because the experience of working with people who are different from you on behalf of a highly pragmatic goal, and learning to bring a group of 6 or 7 people to a point where they can take some kind of action, that's what a jury does. That's so powerful, and it will save you from the mistake of imagining that social change comes from, you put 1 million people in the streets, they all have a street party, it's exciting, it's thrilling, they chant slogans, then they go home, and then something happens. All that street party event does is show holders of power that there is an appetite for something, but it doesn't ever say what that something will be, and it doesn't make it a reality. That is done in committees. Join a committee.
Very interesting. Bureaucracy for the win. Third question is, how would you recommend redistributing congressional power so rural states are not overrepresented?
Yeah. Well, I think the ideal way is very different from the way we're actually going to do it. I think what is actually going to happen is the following: that until 2010, gerrymandering was always restrained by kind of mutual deterrence between Republicans and Democrats. That Republicans had to fear, if you do unto Democrats too much in Texas, they will do unto you the same in California. And so because the two parties were reasonably evenly balanced most of the time at the state level, there was restraint. The combination of the census year of 2010 with the terrible economy of 2008-9, and therefore the big Republican landslide of 2010, disinhibited the Republicans. And they said, we're going to go for the gusto. We're going to gerrymander on a scale not seen, as at least as far back as I can remember. And I think the way we're going to get through this is it looks like the Democrats will requite that action by doing unto the Republicans in 2020. That then opens the door for maybe some other kinds of things. I mean, obviously, politicians should not be drawing seats. You should have some kind of, administrative or judicial body that's you can never get the politics entirely out of politics. The politicians will lobby, but there should be commissions formed of nonpartisan persons. Get the director of the Ford School to chair the commission for Michigan and have experts, and you draw, the fairest possible maps. I think one other thing we need to think very hard about is making the House of Representatives bigger, to allow more leeway to represent heavily settled areas, and to, obviously if Wyoming has a member of the House that's disproportionate to its population, that single House member is more important in a 435 member House than that member would be in a 635 member House. So just making the House bigger can counteract some of these tendencies. As always, though, the real problem will be in the state legislatures and in the U.S. Senate. The House of Representatives, for all of its many faults, is one of the less distorted parts of the U.S. government compared to state governments in the U.S. Senate.
Mm-hmm. Corollary to that, you don't have to answer this if it's too touchy, but would you abolish the Electoral College?
Would I personally? Mm-hmm. Sure. If I had a constitutional convention that was doing what I wanted, but it's not that. I think I would urge people not to think about that, because it can't be done.
And my job as a professor is to make them go there. Your job to stop them. So we balance each other.
No, it would require a constitutional amendment that's not going to happen. So how do you work around the Electoral College? Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think some of these ideas about the PACs where states pledge that they will cast their votes in accordance with the national majority. Mm-hmm. I think also if you change the House of Representatives, you change the Electoral College. If we had a 635 member House that was less distorted, the Senate, that instead of it being 4-1 House to Senate, it would be 6-1 House to Senate. So just that change alone, which doesn't require a constitutional amendment, could go far to make the Electoral College less distorted than it is now.
Great, thank you. Another question: any tips on how to have healthy discourse with someone you don't share political alignments with?
That's a great question, and one I'm sure very much on people's minds. I think I would begin. I'll just tell you my personal answer. The first is, why am I having this discourse? And that's because. Is it because I'm at a family function and I'm seated beside somebody and I have to talk to this person for the next hour? In that case, my answer is the way is just to avoid it. Because if there isn't a reason to do it that's compelling, then there's no disgrace in saying, when crazy Uncle Fred goes on about how COVID is a Chinese plot over Thanksgiving, why do you need to engage with that? Just, and just be confident the other members of the family think Uncle Fred is as much of a lunatic as you do. But there are many circumstances where we can't. And there, the answer, I think, is always you begin by the search for the commonality. Mm-hmm. What is the point where you and I have something in common, and can we work from there? I remember a story David Brooks tells. When he was an undergraduate, he debated Milton Friedman, who's just one of the most incisive intellects of all time. And Rose Friedman, Milton Friedman's wife, who liked David Brooks a lot, he was a student at the University of Chicago, gave him a word of advice. Friedman, when he debates you, will ask you a question. And whatever the question is, refuse to answer it. Because once you grant Friedman a premise, that logic hook gets in the hull of your boat, and he will pull you. He will just force you through the rigor of his analysis. Say, well, since you yourself said this, therefore we must come here. But in a less argumentative way, I think that's what we do. We try to find point. What do we agree about? What do we try? Do you agree that sick people should not be left to die if they can't pay their own medical bill? Mm-hmm. Okay, now you agree with that. All right, now let's work from there. And I think the other thing that I would say about this is, I recently took part in a very interesting experience of. We reimagined for the March on Washington Film Festival the famous debate between Baldwin and Buckley at Cambridge Union in 1965. And I took part in a kind of, not reenactment, but a reimagining of this. And afterwards, we did an interview with the Khalil Mohammed Gibran at Harvard University, and I reimagined the thing. We did a conversation with NPR, and the question came up, what do you think of debating? I don't believe in it, because I don't think you want to. And I don't think when you take part in these discussions, the goal is to convince or to win. The goal is to yourself grow. And if you don't entertain the possibility that in this encounter with another person, another human being, however misguided you may think them, that there is some possibility for you to change, then there's zero possibility that the conversation will go anywhere productive. And so I think you begin by forming not just a what do we agree about as a debating strategy, but as a strategy of emotional connection. Because if there isn't something we both want to do together, then why are we talking at all? But if there is something we want to do together, then we can find that thing that unites us as human beings, as Americans, as citizens of our town, and say, okay, well, we all agree we want people to be healthier, children to be better fed. How do we get there?
As an aside to whoever asked this question, there's a philosopher called Daniel Dennett who has written on compassionate debate. And that's very germane to this question. I think it would be a really good resource to look further into for David's comments. Okay, we have about 4 minutes left. We'll try to get at least one more question in. What should Democrats be doing right now to ensure there is a peaceful transition if there is a change of power?
Yeah. The most important thing for the Democrats right now is to make the popular vote, although it's not legally binding, as impressive as possible. And just this is the thing that Donald Trump is staring in the face. Last time, I think 136 or 137 million people voted in the election of 2016. I think the turnout model suggests at least 150 million will vote in the election of 2020, or at least will try. If it is 150 and you apply to that the average of the polls, 50 for Biden, 43 or thereabouts for Trump, you're looking at a popular vote advantage of 10 to 12 million for Biden. Mm-hmm. And while that doesn't predict the Electoral College, I mean, it is pretty hard to make a grab for power in a country like this with 10 to 12 million people against you, a margin of 10 to 12 million people. So racking up that margin is the key thing, because that has impacts on all kinds of players. In the end, as Donald Trump understands, he can't do it alone. He needs the federal bureaucracy to agree with him. He needs others. The date of the inauguration is in the Constitution. Mm-hmm. It has to happen on the 20th of January at noon. If Joe Biden is sworn in and Donald Trump refuses to leave the White House, mm-hmm. you have a landlord-tenant problem. Mm-hmm. But there is no question that Joe Biden, wherever he is the president of the United States. And the officer who carries the nuclear football, that officer will be at Biden's domain, not at Trump's. And it will be Biden's call that goes through to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And it will be Biden's signature that is binding on bills and Trump's that is worthless. And so you need to have a big enough majority that the other players who are calculating the future for themselves say, you know what, we are not going to indulge whatever adventure Donald Trump has in mind. And we'll pocket our ill-gotten Supreme Court seat and be satisfied with that, and say better luck next year.
Very well said again. We only have a few more minutes left, so I think it's time to conclude. Sorry. David, thank you so much for coming and talking with us. It was really, I learned so much and really engaging and fun to talk with you. So thank you for the privilege.
What a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you to our audience for posing great questions, and please stay tuned to our website and social media for more information about virtual events we have as part of this series at the Ford School. I hope you'll join me in thanking David Frum for his insights, and go Blue.